Staging fictions of privacy in early modern London households. We researchers of 18th century domestic space seek qualitative methods for investigating the past that are reliably useful across disciplines. One theme that each practitioner in the fields represented here today encounters is the vexed issue of privacy, its creation, its maintenance, and its utility. Modern uses of privacy include autonomy, space for unfettered, unobserved self-expression, and intentional withdrawal into seclusion. I suggest here that these were not dominant parts of the definition of privacy in the early modern urban setting, because everyone in the metropolis experienced compromised privacy in our modern sense of the term. For us, the idea of privacy has a primary reference to the establishment of boundaries in physical space, even though we are secondarily aware of the importance of protecting the details of our identities in a digitally interconnected world. In early modern London, the inverse was true. Privacy was primarily fostered by the selective protection of personal information rather than by physical isolation from others. Paradoxically, however, informational privacy had to be literally staged in the metropolis because it greatly depended on the persuasiveness of domestic tableaux. This was a strategy deployed by early modern people of all classes. This is why what the neighbors saw was a point of such significance to Londoners. The fabric and contents of houses were key to this staging effort. In a pre-industrial, primarily oral, face-to-face culture, the creative fiction entailed in maintaining appearances worked most effectively when people relied on the props closest to home: room usages, furnishings, and materials pertaining to the provisioning of households. Every dwelling was potentially a public stage on account of the interpermeability of public and private spaces. Domestic rooms were tableaux vivants, upon which representations of self and others were set and enacted. Charting people's interactions within their dwellings shows us how they nimbly enacted fictions that were meant to protect their intimate lives from scrutiny. In order to understand early modern representations of privacy, then, we can look specifically to the domestic artifacts and settings that people reckoned were important, and assess how people deployed them to construct what they hope were favorable and durable narratives about their lives. The vignettes I offer as qualitative evidence in support of these points derive from my research for a microhistory of one female servant's London community. Between 1694 and 1706, Phoebe Harrison, alias Maurice, sought to establish a public identity for herself that cast her in a far better light than her actual circumstances should have allowed, by creating a picture of her own genteel status as a mother, one that disguised her position as a domestic servant of indeterminate marital circumstances on the edge of destitution. In 1706, Phoebe Harrison countered an exceptional suit in the highest London ecclesiastical court, the Court of Arches. Formally, the suit was for jactitation of marriage, that is, falsely alleging marriage. Louis Anthony de Maurice sought to secure a judgment determining that he was not married to Phoebe. Conversely, Phoebe wanted to demonstrate that she was in fact married to Maurice, minimally as a means of securing his financial support for their child. The excerpts following are taken from the depositions of 3 people brought in as witnesses to the suit. Elizabeth Patrickson arranged lodgings for Phoebe when Phoebe initially arrived in London in search of a place in domestic service as a 20-year-old woman. Rebecca and Robert Lowther housed Phoebe and her infant son 5 years later. Patrickson additionally deposed concerning her interaction with Phoebe a decade after their initial meeting. Phoebe Harrison arrived on the Patricksons' doorstep in Creed Lane, Ludgate, in 1694. She told Elizabeth Patrickson that she had been a servant at Patrickson's father-in-law's house in Cumberland, and that he had recommended her to the Patricksons to assist her and get her a place or service, she declaring she was come to live at London. In the early modern capital, lodgings could be secured even with liminal contacts if the prospective lodger had an introduction or letter of reference to offer. In this way, the ability to secure the privacy that housing nominally represented was firstly linked to word-of-mouth reputation, which in turn relied on the careful management of one's public image. Initially, then, Phoebe's self-presentation was regarded as straightforward by others in her new community. She reported a personal connection to Patrickson's extended family, and her clothing was appropriate to her status as a domestic servant. She was observed to be in very ordinary and mean apparel when she came from the North Country. Her prospective mentors did not think Phoebe had any other clothes than those on her back. Phoebe's strategy of using domestic artifacts to legitimate her status in new settings reliably began with her own clothing. Patrickson's husband was a tobacconist whose rented house was comprised of a cellar shop, 2 chambers, and a garret. Since he said that he had no other bed but what he and his wife lay on, and therefore no conveniency with which to lodge Phoebe, his wife asked her friend Elizabeth Tilley to take Phoebe in as a lodger in Tilley's home in Bell Alley, St. Giles, Cripplegate. Tilley rented a house with 4 rooms, one above the other, wherein she kept a cook shop and sublet 2 rooms to lodgers. In pre-industrial London, shared lodging was very common in houses divided into apartments or rooms. Accordingly, dwellings were pivotal points of interaction between all kinds of highly mobile people of hugely varied circumstances. As was the case for both the Patricksons and Tilley, houses were also the seat of businesses, trades, and manufactories. So the house was the locus not only of familial interaction, but also of community reputation and credit. Even in substantial houses, privacy in the modern sense of physical isolation was scarcely possible, because the requirements for managing those houses meant that servants were always nearby. For this reason, neighborhood geography was most commonly constituted by interconnected networks of living spaces. Many people lived in 1 or more rooms within a single house, and it was common for these rooms to be accessible only through linking hallways or other people's dwelling spaces. It was arranged that Phoebe would share Tilley's bed, but have her victuals or diet at Patrickson's house. She stayed at Tilley's house for 5 weeks, till her lodgings came to half a crown. Patrickson paid Phoebe's bill for the lodging, and Phoebe then disappeared from their view for almost a decade. The people Phoebe encountered in Creed Lane and Bell Alley reported years later that they were aware of at least some of her movements during the period that she was out of their local orbit. Robert and Rebecca Lowther met Phoebe 4 years later in 1697, when she emerged after a long period of itinerancy, working as a servant both in and outside of the capital. We know from the court record that in the interval after she left her lodgings in Bell Alley and Creed Lane, Phoebe began a romantic relationship with a London jeweler named Louis Anthony de Moraes, and we know that she had a child with him. This one fact remained undisputed by all parties. It was clearly articulated by Robert Lowther, who said he has heard Moraes declare that he had a child by Phoebe Moraes, and he has heard Phoebe declare that her child was Moraes' child. Robert Lowther described himself as a coffeeman and draper, a citizen of London. He and his wife Rebecca lived in Shoreditch, at what was then the edge of the metropolis. Louis Moraes rented lodgings from the Lowthers when he was in London and not travelling. Moraes deals in jewels, as Rebecca Lowther hath heard. Robert Lowther said he looks on him to be a person of honour and reputation, and conversant with the first quality in England, and as such he is generally looked upon. The Lowthers said they had known Moraes upwards of 10 years by the time he introduced them to Phoebe. The manner of Phoebe's introduction to the Lowthers is surprising, in light of the fact of what we know about her prior life. Moraes asked them if they could help him to a lodging for a country gentlewoman and her child, of about a month or 5 weeks old. As Robert Lowther told it, in a short time after, such woman, being Phoebe Harrison, alias Moraes, came to his habitation in Shoreditch and lodged there and nursed a child, which Lowther thought was her own, for about the space of 12 months. Louis Anthony de Moraes visited Phoebe 3 or 4 times, but whether he was oftener there Robert Lowther knows not, he being a servant at Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley, and being and lying much oftener there than at Shoreditch. As we will see, Phoebe's suit stands as evidence that if a person of either gender or any social class successfully created a personal image in a household setting and demonstrated its veracity sufficiently to pass public muster, no questions would be asked. Privacy was achieved if normative domestic forms and rituals were observed, and during the period that Harrison lodged in the Lowthers' house, all parties were clearly prepared to hew to the story indicated by the tableau Harrison laid out. Robert Lowther said he never saw any immodesty in the woman he called Phoebe Moraes. Rebecca Lowther said she always entertained Phoebe Moraes and her son civilly, being a modest woman. She always looked on and believed Phoebe Moraes to be a woman of a sober, virtuous life and conversation, not knowing her to keep any company with any man except Moraes. Phoebe saying she was Moraes' wife, and Rebecca Lowther called Phoebe by the name of Moraes, and had no reason to question but that Phoebe was Moraes' wife. It was only a decade after the fact, when the Lowthers were deposed in court concerning Phoebe Harrison's actual identity, that they expressed confusion about her marital status. Robert Lowther did not at any time before the commencement of this suit hear that Phoebe pretended to be married, But since then he has heard it said in common discourse, but from whom in particular he does not remember, that Phoebe pretends to be married to Maurice. His wife deposed, "Phoebe says she is married, and Maurice denies the same, and Rebecca Lather cannot tell what to think thereof." Part of the Lathers' confusion was generated by the court recorder's query concerning Phoebe's potential mimicry of widowed status during the time that she lodged with them, in support of her claim that she was in fact or had been a married woman. Rebecca Lather recalled that she had seen Phoebe in black clothes and plain linen, but not in a widow's weed, and therefore she does not know that Phoebe went as a widow. Robert Lather, for his part, deposed that he never saw Phoebe in a widow's habit, nor does he know that she was advised to put herself in such a habit. During the year she boarded with the Lathers, however, Harrison was convincingly able to create a coherent picture of herself as a married mother of an infant son, whose husband visited her only intermittently. In a period and place in which long absences from home were common for both men and women, this was not in itself unusual. What is key for our purpose of defining privacy in the context of the early modern metropolis is the way that Phoebe self-consciously manipulated the fabric and settings of the houses she lived in, much in the same way she wore the clothing she wore as a sign of her marital status, in order to create this picture. Both Robert and Rebecca Lather put great stock in their observation of Moray's solicitousness of Phoebe and their child concerning any household items and provisions they might require. Robert Lather said that at moments when all were publicly situated in the shared space of the Lathers' house, he has several times in their company been near when Maurice has asked Phoebe if her child wanted necessaries, and he has several times seen Maurice give Phoebe monies to buy necessaries for herself and her child. Rebecca Lather, too, noted that Maurice provided very handsomely for Phoebe and her son during the time of her lodging. She deposed that she has sometimes seen them very loving together, and at other times seen them very angry at each other, but Maurice always provided for Phoebe. Additionally, Maurice did satisfy Lather and his wife for Phoebe and her son's lodging and boarding. The activities of others, whether forthrightly or clandestinely observed and overheard, and the related activity of knowledge transmission, was of paramount importance in this primarily oral metropolitan culture. The character of interpersonal relationships in London was in fact very local. All people were aware of others in proximity to them, irrespective of class, because all interpersonal exchanges, including those that were handwritten, were completed as face-to-face transactions. Accordingly, another way that we can map this within the physical fabric, consider the reading of letters, which was an activity important enough to be explicitly situated in place. Letters were important possessions, hand-delivered to dwellings, that might be read aloud in the public rooms of the house or shown selectively as a demonstration of their possessor's intent. Robert Lather deposed that he has seen Phoebe write, being at some distance from her, but never was so near to her to see how or what she wrote, or as to be acquainted with her manner and character of handwriting. He did say that he had seen some letters which hath been directed and come to his neighbour's wife, which he believes came from Phoebe. For her part, Rebecca Lather said that Maurice had shown her several letters which he has declared came from Phoebe. The contents of the letters were to desire Maurice to let Phoebe have or to send her some necessaries she wanted for herself or her son. When Maurice showed Rebecca Lather such letters, he said that Phoebe gave him a great deal of trouble and perplexed him, and was not satisfied with what he would do for her. However, Robert Lather concluded that he does not know that any love letters or letter was written to Phoebe, nor did he ever see any such letters or letter. The contractual nature of Phoebe's relationship with Maurice was obvious to both Lathers, and their observations of the linked activities of her letter-writing and reading, set in the context of the household, stood for them as strong evidence of same. What is most interesting to me is that neither of the Lathers fundamentally disputed Phoebe's self-presentation as a country gentlewoman, and neither sought to examine closely whether or not she was actually Maurice's wife. In this way, the settings of the household were used to stage presentations of honor, reputation, and modesty. Rooms were stages for self-representational tableaux. Most people held only a limited number of personal possessions, and so the relationships that they could assert they had with other people based on the evidence afforded by their interaction with those things was of singular importance. As noted earlier, it was considered unremarkable for a person to have to walk through a fellow tenant's lodgings to get from one of their own rented rooms to another. Bed curtains were often a substitute for walls in London dwellings, and this could be true right up through the professional classes in the metropolis. Single-layer floor planks routinely stood as the ceiling boards of the rooms below them, so that the unadorned corner attic room for a servant was likely still within easy earshot of the fancy principal bedroom below it. Even the most high-end housing stock in the metropolis might feature plaster party walls that were easily crumbled to make peepholes into other people's living quarters. Robert Lowther said he repeatedly saw Maurice and Phoebe together at Lowther's dwelling house. He has seen Maurice and Phoebe eat a crust of bread and drink a glass of wine together there. Indeed, the Lowthers twice dined with them. Maurice and Phoebe were several times together alone in Rebecca Lowther's bedroom, being Rebecca Lowther's dining room, leaving a bed at one end of it and only a curtain drawn between the bed and that part of the room used as a dining room. Rebecca Lowther said she did not know whether Maurice and Phoebe lay together there, on account of her going to bed and leaving them up at supper together. But Robert Lowther has seen Maurice kiss or salute Phoebe. So, privacy was not equivalent to possibilities inherent in action, while in isolation from other people, as we think of privacy today. Instead, and paradoxically, urban privacy in early modern London was defined by display of behavior and discourse in relation to household objects and their associated practices, set within the fabric of the household itself. This, then, was the domestic setting in which information exchange got especially interesting. Robert Lowther said he hath several times heard Mr. Maurice solemnly declare he never was married to Phoebe, and wish that the wine he hath been drinking might be his poison if he was married to her, and make several other protestations to the same effect. Rebecca Lowther corroborated this account when she reported that Phoebe also told Maurice in Rebecca Lowther's house that she was his wife and would come to him, and Maurice said she was not his wife, and that the devil married her, and she said it was the devil in his clothes. And then they struck each other, and were in a great rage, and so parted. But who struck first, Rebecca Lowther remembers not, although others were then present. Rebecca Lowther has heard Phoebe in passion tell Maurice she was his wife, and would go home to him, and they have quarrelled, and then Maurice has desired Rebecca Lowther to make them friends again. When we use the expression, concerning an object in our house or an arrangement of household space, well, that's just for show. We are signifying that some symbolic aspect of our environment is on display so that others will think well of us. I suggest that in the early modern metropolis, establishing a picture of domestic stability and upstanding social status in this way truly fostered privacy. For the Lowthers, it was permissible for Phoebe to exist in a liminal space wherein she might or might not be married, as long as the staging of her domestic circumstances made her story plausible. The Lowthers were respectful of the fiction Phoebe chose to present and did not ask penetrating questions while she was able to maintain it. Indeed, they were prepared to supply a character reference for Phoebe at the end of her term at their house. Upon Robert Lowther's moving to Exchange Alley, Maurice desired Rebecca Lowther to provide another lodging for Phoebe where she might have good usage, and thereupon Rebecca Lowther recommended Phoebe to lodge and board at the house of William Hockley, Rebecca Lowther's first cousin, then living at Mill Green near Inglestone in Essex. I regret to say that this story did not have a happy ending for Phoebe. That being said, her inability to successfully carry her self-presentation through to the end of her court suit is from our perspective not an unfortunate thing at all, as her ultimate self-exposure substantiates the theme we have been building. The domestic fiction that supported informational privacy was dismantled when the props on which it relied could no longer be physically produced, but only promised. On the last day of February 1706, Phoebe came to Elizabeth Patrickson at her lodgings in Token House Yard, and told Patrickson she was glad to see her. Patrickson asked Phoebe how she could do such a wicked thing as to say she'd lain at Patrickson's house and was married from thence. Phoebe answered that she knew it was false, and that she did not know where to lay it else but upon Patrickson, because she thought Patrickson would not be found out. Phoebe then fell on her knees and desired Patrickson for God's sake not to betray her, and said that Patrickson was the only woman that could ruin her, Phoebe, and desired Patrickson to go home with her. And she said she would keep Patrickson for half a year, and that Patrickson should not want for money, and that she would be a friend to Patrickson as long as Patrickson lived, and that she would give Patrickson as good a satin gown and petticoat as any woman need to wear, and all things answerable to it. When this petition proved unsuccessful, Phoebe came again to Patrickson about a week or a fortnight afterward, and told Patrickson she would make Patrickson the most miserable woman that ever was, and Patrickson should not stir out of her doors. In the end, we have two competing pictures of Phoebe Harrison, alias Moraes. In one household setting, she was able to portray her circumstances in terms that were favorable to her. On another, later household stage, she was not as successful in her assertion of self-presentation and therefore failed to protect her own privacy. Phoebe was unable to deploy the affordance, the potential of the household artifacts around her in such a way as to create a successful social jest. Broadly, this was the period that popularized the domino mask and the masquerade ball, and also the period of Defoe's literary preoccupation with the idea that the social jest, that is, never revealing one's true views and intentions publicly, stood as one's most effective protection of their private, earnest intentions. In London dwellings, fictions of domestic presentation set the proper social jest or informational disguise. In fact, the staging of privacy was dependent on these fictions. In the early 18th century, where a great deal of community interaction took place in houses, much more than now, and wherein physical privacy was very difficult to establish and manage, it's helpful for us as investigators to be attentive to the ways in which people utilized their domestic settings and deployed the artifacts within them. Although early modern notions of privacy were very different from modern ones, privacy can nonetheless be defined in a stable way in the context of urban households in the 18th century. The relative anonymity of the city made it possible for privacy to be constructed out of the selective presentation of information as domestic tableaux vivants. This is why I suggest that privacy in the early modern metropolis can be defined as a drive toward always portraying an active social jest, a favorably positioned mask that revealed or, conversely, hid information according to its possessor's desire. In positing this as a definition that has application across different areas of inquiry into the past, I hope to add an explanatory tool to the interdisciplinary toolbox that we are constructing in common. Thank you.